The unseen battle begins. The sunlit terminal was alive with motion, a sea of travelers weaving through gates, their voices merging into a dull hum beneath the polished ceilings. Marcus Blake stepped inside, adjusting his cufflinks as he took a deep breath. This wasn't his first flight. Far from it. As the CEO and founder of Sky High Airways, Marcus had walked through hundreds of terminals worldwide, yet today felt different. This flight was personal, not another business trip, not another expansion meeting. Just a much-needed break after months of high-stakes deals and relentless work schedules. For once, he would enjoy the very luxury he had designed, his airline's first-class experience, a testament to his success and vision. Marcus was a man who thrived in the shadows of his own empire. Few people outside his closest circle knew that the very airline he was flying on was his creation. It was better that way. He valued his privacy, his ability to move through the world without a parade of attention following him. Today, however, that anonymity was about to be tested. As he made his way toward the security checkpoint, he could feel the subtle shifts in energy around him. The occasional sideways glance, the stiffness in posture, a silent message that he had grown all too familiar with. "Step aside for additional screening, sir," the TSA agent said brusquely. Marcus's jaw tightened, but he obeyed without protest. He had long stopped being surprised by the unspoken rules that applied to men who looked like him. Dark-skinned, well-dressed, yet constantly scrutinized. He watched as other passengers, many with similar belongings, some with bulkier carry-ons, passed through security unbothered. Meanwhile, the agent meticulously inspected his laptop bag, running swabs over it before reluctantly waving him forward. No apology, no explanation, just the silent understanding that this was simply procedure. Marcus nodded to himself and moved on. Gate 12, a first-class problem. Reaching his gate, Marcus pulled his ticket from the inside pocket of his suit jacket. The first-class pass felt crisp between his fingers, a tangible reward for his years of struggle and perseverance, a symbol of how far he had come. He exhaled slowly, looking forward to slipping into his seat, reclining in peace, and disappearing into the quiet luxury he had built. But as he approached the boarding line, an obstacle stood in his path. Rebecca Harris, a woman in her early 40s, dressed sharply in her flight attendant uniform, an air of authority wrapped around her like a second skin. Her face carried the confidence of someone who believed they had the power to decide who belonged and who didn't. Marcus handed her his ticket. Rebecca barely glanced at him before her eyes snapped down to the boarding pass. Her polite mask faltered. A barely concealed frown tugged at the corners of her lips. "This is first class, sir," she said, her tone flat, but laced with something Marcus had heard many times before. Dismissal. Marcus kept his expression neutral. "Yes, I know." Rebecca studied him for a second too long, calculating, doubting. Her fingers gripped the ticket tighter than necessary. Then, leaning in slightly, she lowered her voice. "Are you sure this is your ticket?" A slow breath escaped Marcus's nose. His fingers curled into a loose fist at his side, but his tone remained calm and composed. "It is." Rebecca hesitated. Then, instead of scanning it, she did something Marcus had not expected. She ripped the ticket in half. A sharp tear split through the air. Passengers nearby gasped. A hush fell over the crowd. A few murmurs rose behind him, but Rebecca had already moved on, motioning for the next person to step forward, as if nothing had happened. Marcus froze. For a second, the weight of disbelief pressed against his chest. He had dealt with bias, microaggressions, and unspoken prejudice all his life, but never had someone been so brazen, so utterly shameless in their disregard for his right to exist in a space he had earned. The humiliation burned under his skin. But Marcus Blake was not a man who let his emotions control him. He straightened his shoulders, his voice steady, his presence unwavering. "I'd like to speak to a supervisor." Rebecca's polite mask cracked, but she recovered quickly. eyes darting to the growing line of passengers. "Sir, there's no need for that. If you'd like to rebook, you can head to the service desk." "I'm not rebooking. I'm requesting a supervisor." The finality in his voice sent ripples through the growing crowd. Passengers watched closely now, some shifting uncomfortably, others leaning in with interest. Rebecca's lips pressed into a thin line. She exhaled sharply, then grabbed the intercom phone. "Supervisor to gate 12, please," she said. Her voice clipped. Marcus stepped back, exhaling through his nose, forcing himself to keep his composure. His heart pounded, not from anger, but from the sheer magnitude of what this moment represented. He glanced to the side. Across the waiting area, a middle-aged black woman sat with her teenage son. Their eyes met. A silent message passed between them. Recognition, understanding, solidarity. She gave him a small, knowing nod. He returned it. A moment of reckoning. Minutes later, a man in a neatly pressed blazer hurried over. His name tag read, "Frank Carter, Gate Supervisor." "What seems to be the problem?" Frank asked, looking between Marcus and Rebecca. Marcus held up the remnants of his torn ticket. "This," he said evenly, "was my first-class ticket, which your employee decided to destroy." Frank's face paled. His eyes flicked to Rebecca, who shifted uncomfortably. Rebecca crossed her arms. "I was just following protocol. Mistakes happen." "A mistake," Marcus said, his voice deceptively calm. "Tell me, what part of checking a ticket before tearing it in half was the mistake?" Rebecca's confidence wavered. Frank grabbed his tablet, quickly pulling up the reservation system. His brows furrowed as he typed. A beat passed, then another. Then his face went completely white. "Mr. Blake, I sincerely apologize." Frank's voice had changed completely, his previous neutrality replaced with deep unease. "Your ticket was perfectly valid. There was no issue." Silence spread. Passengers stared, some now openly whispering, while others looked away in discomfort. Marcus gave a knowing nod. "Yes, I know." His eyes locked onto Rebecca. Her cheeks burned red, but she kept silent. Frank scrambled for a solution, his nervous energy palpable. "I'll have a replacement first-class ticket issued immediately. Please accept our sincerest apologies." Marcus tilted his head. His voice was like steel, wrapped in silk. "And the matter of your employee's actions?" Frank hesitated. Rebecca stiffened. The air around them grew heavier. Marcus was not just asking for an apology. He was asking for accountability. And for once, the world was watching. The weight of power and the breaking point. Frank Carter, the gate supervisor, shifted his weight uncomfortably. The air between him, Marcus, and Rebecca thickened with unspoken tension. A mistake had been made, and now the weight of accountability pressed down on everyone. Passengers still lingered nearby, their eyes flickering between Marcus's unwavering stance and the airline employees scrambling to find an escape route. Rebecca's shoulders were stiff, her previous arrogance dissolving into unease as she sensed the growing gravity of the situation. Frank cleared his throat, forcing a strained smile. "Mr. Blake, I assure you that we take these matters seriously." His hands fiddled with the tablet he held, as if the device could shield him from the intensity of Marcus's gaze. "I'll file a full report on this incident and ensure a formal review is conducted." Marcus tilted his head slightly, reading every inch of Frank's expression. He had played this game before, where corporate apathy masqueraded as concern. This wasn't the first time someone had promised an internal review, only for nothing to change. "A report, huh?" Marcus's voice was low, controlled. "Let me ask you something, Frank. What do you think that report will accomplish?" Frank blinked, caught off guard. "Well, it will ensure we evaluate." "Evaluate, not fix." Marcus cut in smoothly, his words precise. "You mean it will be buried in some compliance officer's inbox, never to be seen again?" Frank's lips pressed together, but he had no real argument. He knew Marcus was right. The murmuring from the passengers grew louder, the tension building like an electrical charge. Rebecca, still standing rigid, spoke up suddenly, her voice sharper than before. "Sir, I was only following protocol. If we allowed every—" She caught herself, realizing she was about to say something truly damning. Marcus arched an eyebrow, giving her the chance to finish. "Go on. Allowed every—" "What?" Rebecca's jaw clenched. She wasn't used to being challenged this way. "I mean, sometimes people try to board first class when they don't belong there." A hush fell over the gate. The words hung in the air, exposing the ugly truth beneath them. They don't belong there. Marcus let out a slow, deep breath. "And what exactly about me made you so sure I didn't belong?" Rebecca's mouth opened, then snapped shut. She knew she had walked into a corner she couldn't escape from. Before she could answer, Frank abruptly cut in, his face now glistening with nervous sweat. "Mr. Blake, I—" Marcus held up a hand, silencing him. "Don't bother," he said, his voice now edged with something darker, heavier. He wasn't here for corporate excuses. He had heard enough. Revealing the truth. At that moment, a familiar voice echoed from behind the counter. "Oh my God, Marcus." The heads of both Rebecca and Frank snapped toward the voice. A younger woman stepping out from a side terminal. Her uniform bore the same Sky High Airways logo, but her badge read Senior Operations Manager, Erica Townsend. Her eyes widened in recognition as she took in the scene. Marcus standing tall, the shredded ticket still in his grip, and Rebecca looking like she wished she could disappear. "Mr. Blake," she repeated, her tone now cautious, scanning the terminal's growing audience. "What's going on here?" Before anyone else could answer, Frank sputtered. "Wait, you know him." Erica's face twisted in a mixture of shock and exasperation. She turned back to Marcus, reading the situation immediately. "Let me guess," she said, her voice lowering. "They had no idea who you were." Marcus chuckled, but there was no humor in it. That would be an understatement. The realization crashed down on Frank like a tidal wave. His mouth opened and closed, struggling to form words. Rebecca's face drained of color, her grip tightening against the counter. For a second, no one spoke. Then Frank stumbled forward, his words tumbling over each other in panic. "Sir, I had no idea. If I had known who you were, Marcus's head snapped up, his expression sharp. "That's the problem, Frank." The words landed with the force of a hammer. Frank froze. Marcus took a deliberate step forward, his eyes piercing. "You're telling me that if you had known I was the CEO of this airline, I would have been treated differently?" His voice remained calm, measured, but its weight pressed down on everyone. "But because you didn't know, it was perfectly fine to assume I didn't belong." Frank swallowed hard, realizing his mistake too late. Around them, passengers watched in wide-eyed silence, some exchanging looks of outrage, others pulling out their phones, discreetly recording the moment. Erica's expression hardened. "Mr. Blake, I sincerely apologize for this. I'll make sure immediate action is taken." Marcus held up a hand. "I don't want apologies," he said. "I want accountability." His voice carried across the entire gate. Passengers shifted in anticipation. Marcus turned to Rebecca, who still hadn't said a word, her lips pressed so tight they were turning white. "I want to know what you're going to do to fix this," he said, addressing both her and Frank. Rebecca finally exhaled, her composure shaken. She hesitated, then, perhaps for the first time, truly looked at Marcus. Not as an assumption, not as a mistake, but as a man she had deliberately humiliated. "I made a mistake," she admitted, voice low. Marcus nodded once. "And?" Rebecca hesitated again. Then, "I need to do better." The words were halting, but genuine. The weight of the moment finally breaking through her walls. Frank shifted, then spoke up as well. "I take full responsibility. I should have stepped in sooner." Marcus didn't react at first. Then he slowly nodded. Good. Now let's make sure this never happens again. The power of choice. Passengers broke into quiet murmurs, some nodding in approval, others giving Marcus looks of admiration. But for Marcus, this was only the beginning. As he finally received his replacement first-class ticket, he turned toward Erica. "We need to talk about Sky High's training program," he said, his tone unwavering. Erica nodded. "Absolutely." As Marcus walked toward the jet bridge, his mind was already on the next steps. This wasn't just about his experience today. It was about every single person who had been humiliated, dismissed, or treated unfairly just for existing in a space they had earned. This wouldn't happen again. Not at Sky High Airways. Not on his watch. And as he took his seat in first class, Marcus made a silent vow. The change was only just beginning. A storm of change. Marcus settled into his first-class seat, exhaling slowly. The confrontation at Gate 12 still burned in his mind. But it wasn't anger that sat heavy in his chest. It was resolve. The plush leather recliner welcomed him, the very luxury he had envisioned when he built Sky High Airways, now serving as a stark reminder of the battle he had just fought to sit here. A battle that shouldn't have happened in the first place. Passengers continued boarding, some throwing stolen glances his way, others offering hesitant smiles or nods, silent acknowledgments of what had just unfolded. The flight attendants in first class moved with professional ease, their demeanor warm, their service impeccable. One of them, a young man with neatly combed hair, approached him. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Blake." His voice carried an edge of nervousness, though he masked it well. "Can I get you anything before takeoff?" Marcus gave him a small nod, his voice measured. "A water would be fine. Thank you." The attendant hurried off, and Marcus reclined slightly, staring out the cabin window. Outside, airport personnel bustled across the tarmac, the flashing lights of luggage carts and refueling trucks moving like pieces in an endless game. He turned his focus inward. What had happened today could not be ignored. But fixing it wouldn't be as simple as just firing Rebecca Harris or ensuring Frank Carter issued a formal apology. No, the problem was systemic, and systemic problems required systemic solutions. An unexpected announcement. Just as Marcus was reaching for his laptop to start drafting his next course of action, a familiar voice crackled through the plane's intercom. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, this is your flight captain speaking. We are set for an on-time departure today, and we should have smooth skies ahead on our way to Los Angeles." The routine pre-flight announcement continued, but Marcus caught something in the captain's tone. A slight hesitation, a flicker of recognition. Then, "Before we take off, I'd like to personally acknowledge one of our passengers today, a man whose vision and leadership have made this flight, and many others, possible." Marcus froze. Passengers started whispering. Heads turned toward him. The captain continued. "Mr. Marcus Blake, the CEO and founder of Sky High Airways, is on board with us today. We thank him for being here and for the work he has done to make Sky High a leader in the industry." A ripple of applause moved through the cabin. Marcus exhaled sharply, adjusting his watch as the attention settled on him. He was used to moving unseen. But today, the world saw him. He nodded once, offering a small wave to the flight crew. The whispers persisted a moment longer before fading back into the rhythm of travel. But Marcus could still feel the shift in energy around him. His presence was no longer anonymous, and that meant he had work to do. Sky High Airways under the microscope. As soon as the plane reached cruising altitude, Marcus pulled out his laptop. He had emails to send. The first one went to Erica Townsend, the senior operations manager who had stepped in at the gate. Subject: Immediate Action Plan. "Erica, thank you for stepping in today. I trust that you understand the gravity of what happened. But fixing it requires more than just disciplinary action. It requires an overhaul of our internal systems. I want a full review of our employee bias training, passenger experience protocols, and hiring/promotion policies. I also want a report on the number of discrimination-related complaints filed by passengers or staff in the last 5 years, how they were handled, and what outcomes were reached. Schedule a meeting with me, the executive team, and the Diversity and Inclusion Department as soon as I land in Los Angeles. This stops today. Marcus Blake. He hit send. Then, without missing a beat, he sent another shorter but sharper email to Alan Reynolds, the Regional Operations Manager. Subject: Accountability required. Airline. Rebecca Harris is to be placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation. Furthermore, I want a direct assessment of all gate personnel to determine if bias or misconduct is a pattern, not just an incident. We are going to fix this the right way. Marcus. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, but before he could send his next email, the flight attendant returned with his water. "Here you go, sir," he said, setting the glass down carefully. Marcus glanced at his name tag. Darren. Marcus studied him for a moment. Darren's posture was straight, his professionalism on display. But there was something else in his eyes. Recognition. "I saw what happened at the gate, sir," Darren said, lowering his voice. I just wanted to say thank you." Marcus arched an eyebrow. "For what?" Darren hesitated, then sighed. "For not letting it slide. Most people would have just let it happen and walked away." Marcus studied him. "Have you experienced something like that before?" Darren gave a small, bitter smile. "All the time. Just not as open." Marcus nodded once. He understood. "Too well." "Things are going to change, Darren," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I promise you that." Darren's smile shifted, becoming something closer to hope. "Then I'll hold you to that, sir." With a polite nod, Darren moved on, attending to another passenger. Marcus sat back, staring at the digital clock on his screen. He had 5 hours until landing. 5 hours to put together the foundation of something that could change Sky High Airways forever. So he got to work. The ripple effect. By the time the flight landed in Los Angeles, Marcus had outlined an entirely new passenger experience initiative, one that would ensure what happened to him never happened to another customer again. Drafted a new internal bias training program, requiring quarterly retraining rather than just a one-time session. Created a 3-tier accountability system to hold employees responsible for biased behavior. No more slap-on-the-wrist apologies. Initiated a leadership audit to assess who had been promoted unfairly over more qualified employees. As the seatbelt sign switched off, Marcus exhaled sharply. He wasn't just going to fix Sky High Airways. He was going to rebuild it from the ground up. As he stepped off the plane, his phone vibrated. An email. From Alan Reynolds. Subject: Rebecca Harris termination notice. Marcus opened it. His eyes scanned the words carefully, taking in the formal language confirming Rebecca's immediate dismissal. He sighed. It was the right move, but not the endgame. Because this was never just about one person. This was about an entire system that needed to be torn apart and built back the right way. And Marcus Blake was going to do it. One policy, one rule, one flight at a time. The reckoning begins. The moment Marcus stepped off the plane at LAX, the gravity of his mission settled in his chest. He wasn't just an angry passenger seeking justice. He was the CEO of a billion-dollar airline walking into a battle that would define the legacy of his company. And the entire world was watching. The confrontation at Gate 12 had already started making waves online. A few passengers had recorded parts of the incident with Rebecca Harris, posting clips to social media with captions like, "Racist flight attendant rips up a first-class ticket. Turns out, the guy owns the whole airline." This man was humiliated at the airport. Then the staff found out he's the CEO. The hashtags #accountability in the air, #Sky High Scandal, and #Marcus Blake Speaks were already trending by the time Marcus reached his waiting car. His assistant, Leah, A sharp-eyed woman who had been his right hand for nearly a decade stood by the black sit-in, phone in hand. She barely glanced up from her screen as she spoke. Social media is blowing up. News outlets are picking up the story, but corporate hasn't made a statement yet. Marcus nodded as he slid into the car. Leah followed, closing the door behind her. "Did Erica confirm the executive meeting?" he asked. Leah gave a firm nod, still scrolling through her tablet. "They're waiting for you at headquarters. But Marcus, you should know something before you walk in." Marcus glanced up. Leah wasn't easily shaken, but her expression was tight, controlled. Alan Reynolds made Rebecca Harris's termination official, but corporate is already trying to downplay it. Marcus stilled. Define downplay. Leah sighed, flipping her screen around so Marcus could see the email chain circulating among Sky High's board members. "We acknowledge the unfortunate incident at Gate 12. However, this appears to be an isolated case and not a reflection of Sky High Airways' values. We must be careful not to overcorrect based on one mistake. Firing Harris should be sufficient." Marcus felt his jaw tighten. They still didn't get it. This wasn't about one employee's mistake. It was about a systemic issue in the company culture. And now, his own executives were trying to sweep it under the rug. Marcus exhaled slowly, staring out the window as the car weaved through Los Angeles traffic. The reckoning was coming, and he was going to make sure everyone in Sky High Airways felt it. The boardroom showdown. When Marcus entered Sky High headquarters, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Every executive was already seated in the boardroom, their faces tense, uncertain. As Marcus strode in, their eyes followed him, some filled with respect, others with hesitation. He took his usual seat at the head of the table, then leaned forward, folding his hands. "Let's not waste time." His voice was calm but unyielding. "I assume everyone here saw what happened." A few executives shifted uncomfortably. Vanessa Green, the chief communications officer, nodded hesitantly. "Yes, Marcus. We're aware of the situation." "Good," Marcus said. Then his eyes hardened. "Because what happened at Gate 12 isn't just a situation. It's a symptom of a much bigger problem." Silence. Then Paul Whitman, one of the older board members, sighed and leaned back in his chair. "Marcus, I understand that what happened to you was unfortunate. But let's be realistic. This was an isolated incident. Firing the flight attendant should be enough to stop." Marcus's voice was like steel, cutting through the room. Paul blinked in surprise. Marcus turned, his gaze piercing every executive at the table. "Let me tell you something," he said. "This wasn't unfortunate. This wasn't an isolated incident. And if you think firing Rebecca Harris is the solution, then you're not paying attention." Paul's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. Marcus continued, his voice growing sharper. "I have emails, reports, years of complaints from employees and passengers alike about how bias and discrimination operate in this company. And yet, every single one of you sat in this room and let it happen." Some executives looked away, their faces guilty. Others stayed silent, too afraid to speak. Marcus took a breath, steadying himself. "This company was built on my vision," he said, "and I refuse to let my vision become a lie." Vanessa cleared her throat carefully. "Marcus, if I may, what exactly do you propose?" Marcus's expression didn't waver. "We're not just going to fire one employee and call it a day," he said. "We're going to rebuild Sky High from the inside out. The plan for systemic change." Marcus stood, clicking a button on the projector. The first slide of his presentation appeared on the screen behind him, bold and unapologetic. Aviation justice. The new future of Sky High Airways. The first step, Marcus said, is mandatory bias training. Quarterly, not yearly. Every employee, from frontline staff to executives, will be required to complete it. A murmur of surprise rippled through the room. "Second," he continued, flipping to the next slide, "we're launching a passenger accountability policy. If a passenger exhibits discriminatory behavior towards staff or fellow travelers, they will face consequences, up to and including being banned from flying with us. The room erupted into whispers. Wait, wait. Paul leaned forward, his face pale. You're saying we'd ban customers? Marcus's jaw tightened. If customers can't treat our employees with basic human respect, they don't deserve to fly with us. Vanessa nodded slowly, her mind already working through the PR implications. Marcus continued. Third, we're overhauling hiring and promotion policies. Right now, white employees are promoted 60% faster than employees of color, despite equal performance reviews. That ends today. A dead silence fell over the room. Then, finally, Paul sighed in defeat. Marcus, he said, running a hand down his face, you're going to shake up the entire company with this. Marcus leaned forward, his voice like thunder before a storm. Good. The aftermath. By the time Marcus left the boardroom, he knew things had changed, not just because he had demanded it, but because for the first time, Sky High's leadership had no choice but to listen. The next morning, the company released an official statement. Sky High Airways is committed to building a future of equity, accountability, and respect. We acknowledge past shortcomings and pledge to implement sweeping reforms to ensure that all passengers and employees experience a just and inclusive environment. The press exploded. News outlets scrambled to cover the story, praising Sky High for its bold stance on bias and discrimination. But Marcus didn't care about the headlines, because this wasn't about optics. This was about doing what was right. A new legacy. 2 weeks later, Marcus was boarding another flight, this time as a regular passenger once more. As he reached the gate, a familiar voice called out, "Mr. Blake." He turned. It was Darren, the young flight attendant who had spoken to him on his last flight. Darren's smile was wider this time. "I just wanted to say, thank you. The changes you made, they mean something to all of us." Marcus nodded, clapping him on the shoulder. "That's the whole point," he said. As he boarded, he knew, deep in his soul, that Sky High Airways would never be the same again. And that was exactly how it should be. The industry shakes as Marcus Blake takes a stand. The moment Sky High Airways' official statement hit the public, it was like a grenade had been thrown into the aviation industry. For years, discrimination in air travel had been treated like an open secret, whispered about in quiet corners, occasionally surfacing in viral incidents, only to be forgotten after the outrage died down. Not this time. Not with Marcus Blake at the helm. Media frenzy and corporate backlash. By the time Marcus left the office that evening, the media was in a frenzy. CEO of Sky High Airways takes a bold stand against discrimination. Will other airlines follow? CNN. Passengers are applauding Sky High Airways' new passenger accountability policy. But will it work? BBC. Marcus Blake's reforms could change air travel forever, or ruin his company. Forbes. Some called him a trailblazer. Others, a reckless disruptor. But one thing was clear. Everyone was talking about it. Not just customers. Other airlines. Investors. Competitors. Even lawmakers. As Marcus rode home in his car, Leah, his ever-efficient assistant, kept her eyes glued to her tablet. She didn't look up as she spoke. "You have 12 interview requests, including Good Morning America, NBC, and BBC." Marcus sighed, rubbing his temples. "Let's hold off on that for now. We need action, not just talk." Leah nodded but hesitated. "There's something else." Marcus glanced over. "What?" Leah exhaled. "Some of our biggest corporate partners are concerned." Marcus's jaw tightened. Define concerned. Leah tapped on her screen and turned it toward him. A forwarded email. Subject: urgent discussion needed. Marcus. While we respect your leadership, we need to discuss the long-term impact of these policies. Several of our corporate partners are questioning the feasibility of banning passengers based on subjective discrimination claims. This could set a dangerous precedent. We advise caution moving forward. Sky High Corporate Legal Team. Marcus stared at the email for a long moment. His grip on his phone tightened. So this was it. The expected resistance from corporate executives and investors who cared more about profit margins than principles. Leah watched him carefully. "What do you want to do?" Marcus's voice was like steel when he answered. "Schedule a call with them." Leah's eyebrows raised slightly. "You're going to negotiate." Marcus let out a low chuckle, but there was no humor in it. "I'm going to tell them they can either support the future or be left behind in the past." A private war in the corporate world. The conference call the next morning was tense from the very first second. The executives and investors appeared on screen, their expressions calculating, uneasy. The first to speak was Peter Langley, one of the largest stakeholders in Sky High Airways, a billionaire with investments in multiple airlines. His voice was calm, but firm. "Marcus, I'll be direct. Your new policies are ambitious, but banning passengers, that's dangerous." Marcus folded his hands. Dangerous for who? Langley hesitated. "For the airline industry, you're talking about restricting customer access based on behavior that can be difficult to prove. That opens us up to lawsuits. Do you really want to deal with that?" Marcus's expression didn't change. "What I want," he said, his voice unwavering, "is an airline that doesn't tolerate discrimination against staff or passengers. If a customer can be banned for being drunk and disorderly, they sure as hell can be banned for calling a black flight attendant a racial slur." A beat of silence. Then another executive, Margaret Owens, spoke up. She was older, shrewd, her silver hair pinned in a precise bun. "Marcus, we support diversity initiatives." "We do. But—" "No." Marcus cut her off sharply. "I'm not interested in hearing the usual corporate excuses. Either we're serious about making a change, or we're not." Langley sighed, rubbing his forehead. "Look, Marcus, we're investors. Our job is to ensure Sky High's long-term financial health. If this hurts revenue, we all lose." Marcus leaned in slightly, his eyes locked onto the camera. "You think racism hasn't already cost this company money?" Langley frowned. "You think customers haven't chosen other airlines because they don't feel safe on ours? You think employees haven't walked away because they don't see a future here?" Silence. Marcus let his words sink in. Then he delivered the final blow. "You all know my track record," he said, voice calm, yet unshakable. "I built this airline from the ground up. I made it a leader in the industry, and I'm telling you right now, this is where the future is headed." A pause. Then Marcus sat back. "You can either stand with me, or you can get the hell out of my way." The shift begins. By the time the call ended, something had changed. The resistance wasn't gone, but it was cracking. By the end of the week, Sky High officially approved the passenger accountability policy, making it the first airline in the world to enforce consequences for discriminatory behavior. Employee bias training became mandatory, with random assessments to ensure effectiveness. Sky High announced a new leadership pipeline program to mentor and promote underrepresented employees. Not everyone was happy. But the change was happening. And Marcus wasn't stopping here. The call that changed everything. One night, as Marcus sat in his office, his phone rang. A number he didn't recognize. He hesitated, then answered. Marcus Blake speaking. A pause. Then a voice he hadn't expected. "Mr. Blake, this is the U.S. Department of Transportation." Marcus straightened immediately. "We'd like to discuss your new policies. Some of us believe they could set a precedent for the entire airline industry." Marcus's heart pounded. This wasn't just about Sky High Airways anymore. This was about rewriting the rules of air travel itself. As he leaned forward in his chair, a slow, determined smile spread across his face. Tell me when and where. The battle for the skies begins. Marcus Blake had always known that change never came without resistance. But as he stared at his phone, the voice of a U.S. Department of Transportation official still echoing in his ears, he realized something else. This wasn't just about sky-high airways anymore. The reforms he had fought for, the policies on bias, the banning of discriminatory passengers, the push for accountability, were shaking the foundation of the entire airline industry. And now, the government was watching, and his rivals were circling. The warning from Washington. The following morning, Marcus found himself in a sleek conference room in Washington, D.C., seated across from two high-ranking officials from the Department of Transportation, DOT. Across from him sat Eleanor Prescott, the Secretary of Transportation, and Daniel Whittaker, a senior legal advisor. Their expressions were measured, their voices calm. But Marcus had dealt with enough high-powered executives to recognize when someone was about to issue a veiled threat. "Mr. Blake," Eleanor began, folding her hands neatly on the table, "your recent policies at Sky High Airways have stirred considerable attention." Marcus leaned back, keeping his expression neutral. That was the point. Eleanor didn't blink. "Your passenger accountability policy. The idea of banning travelers based on reports of discrimination is unprecedented. It's bold." Marcus waited. She sighed, exchanging a glance with Daniel before continuing. "But there are concerns," she said carefully. "The aviation industry has always operated under the principle of universal access. If a major airline begins banning passengers for subjective reasons, we could see a wave of legal challenges." Marcus's fingers tapped once against the table. "There's nothing subjective about someone screaming slurs at a flight attendant or refusing to be served by black or brown crew members," he said coolly. "We ban drunk and violent passengers all the time. What's the difference?" Daniel cleared his throat. "The difference, Mr. Blake, is that you're entering uncharted legal territory. If other airlines follow suit, we could be looking at federal regulations being rewritten ****. Marcus smiled faintly. "That's a good thing." Eleanor exhaled, her gaze narrowing slightly. "Not everyone agrees." That's when Daniel slid a folder across the table. Marcus opened it. Inside was a list of major airlines: Delta, United, American Airlines, even some European carriers. And beneath their names, a signed petition requesting the DOT to intervene in Sky High Airways' new policies. Marcus's blood ran cold. "They're trying to block the policy?" he asked, scanning the document. Eleanor nodded. "They claim it's anti-consumer and subjective enforcement of behavior." Marcus let out a slow breath, closing the folder. So this was their move. The industry felt threatened, so they were trying to shut him down. But Marcus Blake had never backed down from a fight. Enemies in the shadows. By the time Marcus returned to Sky High's headquarters, Leah was already waiting for him. She had a stack of reports in her hands, her expression unreadable. "We have a problem," she said, walking beside him as they strode through the executive floor. "Rival airlines aren't just petitioning the government. They're starting a full-scale attack on Sky High." Marcus glanced over. "How bad?" Leah handed him a printout of a leaked internal memo from one of their competitors, United Skyways. Internal Strategy Brief. United Skyways. "With Sky High Airways implementing passenger bans, we have an opportunity to position ourselves as the airline for everyone. Messaging should emphasize freedom, choice, and inclusion, without addressing discrimination policies directly. Target disaffected Sky High customers with a new promotional campaign. Your ticket, your right. Additionally, we should assess whether certain high-value corporate clients are reconsidering partnerships with Sky High due to their aggressive policies. We may be able to absorb some of their market share." Marcus's hands tightened around the paper. "They're trying to paint us as exclusionary, while they profit off discrimination," he muttered. Leah nodded. "They're already running ads on social media. Some conservative media outlets are calling your policies woke overreach. Marcus exhaled sharply, setting the paper down. This was worse than he expected. It wasn't just about his policies anymore. It was about survival. Sky High was now a target, not just from regulators, but from competitors who saw an opportunity to bleed them dry. And the worst part? It was working. Early reports showed a small dip in bookings. Some passengers, especially business travelers, were hesitating to book flights with Sky High, uncertain about the controversy. The battle had begun, and Marcus had only one option left: to go on the offensive. The CEO fights back. The next morning, Marcus called a press conference. Journalists from CNN, BBC, The New York Times, and other major outlets packed the room. Cameras flashed. Microphones were set. And when Marcus stepped onto the stage, the world watched. He didn't hold back. Sky High Airways will not back down. The moment the words left his mouth, the room fell silent. Let's be clear, Marcus continued. Some airlines want you to believe that banning hateful, discriminatory passengers is somehow a violation of freedom. He let that sink in. But I ask you, whose freedom matters more? A murmur ran through the audience. The freedom of a flight attendant to do their job without being harassed. The freedom of a black passenger not to be singled out for extra screening. The freedom of a Muslim traveler not to be questioned for existing. He leaned forward, voice steady, powerful. The airlines trying to sabotage this policy are the same ones who've ignored discrimination in their own cabins for years. They don't want change. They want silence. The reporters furiously took notes. And as for those claiming this will hurt business, Marcus smiled coldly. If refusing to tolerate discrimination means losing a few customers, so be it. Gasps, flashes from the cameras. Marcus stepped back. Because we at Sky High know where the future is going. He let the room breathe before delivering his final blow. The only question is, who's brave enough to follow? The aftermath. That evening, Marcus's speech was everywhere. News anchors debated his words. Social media exploded. #MarcusBlakey trended on Twitter. And most importantly, Sky High Airways stock stabilized. The customers who left, they were replaced by thousands more who supported the movement. Other airlines, ones that had been silent, started to rethink their own policies. The fight was far from over. But Marcus had just changed the entire conversation. A call from an unlikely ally. Late that night, as Marcus sat in his office, his phone rang. An unknown number. He answered. A deep voice spoke. Marcus Blake. Marcus sat up straighter. Yes. Who's this? A pause. Then, I'm the CEO of United Skyways. I think we need to talk. The industry revolution. The phone line buzzed with a strange tension, like an invisible battlefield stretching between Marcus Blake and the CEO of United Skyways. Marcus had spent the last several weeks fighting off corporate sabotage, government pressure, and media scrutiny, all while trying to reshape the very foundation of the airline industry. And now, his biggest rival was calling. Mr. Blake, we need to talk. The voice on the other end was calm, controlled, and calculating. Marcus leaned back in his chair, watching the city lights flicker outside his window. I'm listening. A brief pause. Then, this fight you've started, the United Skyways CEO said carefully, is bigger than you realize. Marcus's fingers tapped lightly on his desk. I'm well aware. The man exhaled sharply. Then you must know that if Sky High pushes these policies too aggressively, you won't just be battling a few airline execs. I expected resistance, Marcus said. Another pause. Then the CEO's voice lowered. Marcus, they want you gone. The words hung in the air like a live wire. And Marcus smiled. The undercurrents of war. Marcus had always known the airline industry wasn't just about travel. It was about power, control, and maintaining an unspoken status quo. For decades, the industry had been ruled by a network of legacy carriers, operating under the same unspoken agreements. Ignore discrimination complaints unless they became public. Protect profit margins above all else. Appease corporate partners over employees. And then, Marcus Blake came in and flipped the script. His passenger accountability policy had forced conversations no one wanted to have. His hiring reforms had disrupted the old boys club that controlled leadership positions in major airlines. His refusal to back down had made him a problem. And now, that problem was being targeted. United Skyway's hidden agenda. The United Skyway's CEO cleared his throat. "I don't agree with everything you're doing, Marcus." Marcus wasn't surprised. United Skyways had launched a marketing campaign against SkyHigh, painting themselves as the airline for everyone. They weren't here to support him. They were here because they were afraid. "But I also know that if SkyHigh succeeds," the man continued, "the rest of us will be forced to follow. The industry will change. Maybe permanently." Marcus's jaw tightened. "That's the idea." Another pause. Then the CEO's voice took on a harder edge. "Do you know who your real enemies are, Marcus?" Marcus's eyes narrowed. "Enlighten me." The man sighed. "You're thinking too small. The other airlines, they're just reacting to what you started." Then who's actually leading the charge? A long silence. Then, the private investors and lobbyists who fund the industry. Marcus froze. He had spent the last few weeks fighting airline competitors and government regulators. But what if the real battle was happening behind the scenes? A billion-dollar conspiracy. Leah was already waiting in his office when Marcus hung up the call. "Something's not adding up," he muttered, tossing his phone onto the desk. Leah didn't miss a beat. "I know." She handed him a confidential report, her eyes sharp with urgency. "SkyHigh's biggest investors aren't just questioning our policies," she said. "They're pulling out." Marcus's brow furrowed. "How bad?" Leah flipped open a spreadsheet. High Ridge Capital pulled $90 million. Global Air Investment Group pulled $120 million. Summit Holdings pulled $150 million. Marcus let out a low whistle. "This isn't hesitation," he murmured. "This is an orchestrated attack." Leah nodded grimly. "They want SkyHigh to crumble before these policies take root." Marcus clenched his fists. So that was their plan. If they couldn't stop him with public backlash, legal threats, or media pressure, they would break him financially, starve his company of funding, force SkyHigh into crippling debt. And then, they'd either force him to resign, or they'd buy him out. It was corporate warfare at its finest. And Marcus, he wasn't going down without a fight. The next move, Marcus goes public. The next morning, Marcus made his boldest move yet. A live-streamed press conference, one that no one saw coming. He stepped onto the stage with his sleeves rolled up, his posture strong but calm. The cameras zoomed in, reporters leaned forward, and then Marcus spoke. "Good morning. Some of you may have heard that certain investors are pulling out of SkyHigh Airways. Some of you may have read articles claiming that my policies are bad for business. Let me tell you the truth. This isn't about business. This is about power. For decades, the airline industry has operated on an unspoken rule. Don't rock the boat. Don't challenge the way things have always been done. Don't make noise about discrimination. Don't fight for the employees who make these flights possible. I broke that rule. And now, the people who benefit from the old system are trying to shut me down. They are trying to suffocate SkyHigh Airways financially, not because my policies are bad for business, but because they are bad for their business. They want an airline industry where a black CEO doesn't have the power to change things. They want an industry where the only color that matters is the color of money. Well, I have news for them. They don't own the skies. And they don't own me. SkyHigh Airways isn't backing down. Not today. Not ever. The fallout. Within hours, the press conference was everywhere. Social media exploded. Sky-high customers flooded the airline with support, booking flights just to show solidarity. #DuIOwnTheSkis trended worldwide. And then something no one expected happened. An offer from the most unexpected place. As Marcus sat in his office, his phone rang again. Another unknown number. He answered. A deep, measured voice spoke. "Mr. Blake, this is Elijah Carter, CEO of Phoenix Air." Marcus's eyes narrowed. Phoenix Air was a rising competitor in the industry, a smaller but aggressively growing airline. The only airline that hadn't spoken out against Sky-High's reforms. Elijah's next words sent a shockwave through Marcus's system. "I think it's time for Sky-High and Phoenix Air to work together. If they're trying to bleed you out, let's make sure they regret it."